They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But for some, the most satisfying vengeance is a dish served hot, at a grand family gathering with the finest wine. It's a dish prepared with a secret ingredient, a truth so horrifying it can destroy not just a life, but a legacy. What happens when a woman, pushed beyond the limits of suffering, decides to turn her prison into her kitchen, and her tormentor into the main course? This is a story about the darkest form of poetic justice, a feast where the guests of honor are forced to consume the very source of their power and cruelty. Before we serve up this chilling tale of culinary retribution, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You'll want a seat at this table for the shocking final course. Now, let us introduce you to Alara Thorne, a woman who decided that the only way to make her husband's family understand the man they had created was to have them take a piece of him for themselves. Literally, Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a dynasty cast in stone and shadow. It stood on a sprawling, isolated estate in the oldest part of New England, a formidable Gothic revival mansion that seemed to command the very landscape around it. Ancient oaks, their branches like skeletal fingers, clawed at the sky, and the gardens, though meticulously manicured, seemed to hold a wild, untamable darkness at their heart. The house had belonged to the Thorne family for over a century, a monument to their immense wealth, their unshakable influence, and the countless secrets entombed within its cold, granite walls. For Alara Thorne, the manor's chatelaine for the past decade, it was not a home. It was a mausoleum, a beautiful, impeccably decorated mausoleum where her own soul had been slowly, methodically laid to rest. At 35, Alara possessed a quiet, fragile beauty, like a pressed flower that retained its form but had lost all its color and life. Her movements were graceful but hesitant, her voice soft, almost a whisper, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space in the world. But her eyes, a deep, stormy gray, held a story of profound and silent suffering. They were the eyes of a prisoner who knows every crack in her cell wall, who has paced its perimeter 1,000 times, and who has long since abandoned any hope of escape. Her jailer was her husband, Marcus Thorne. To the outside world, Marcus was the epitome of success and charm. Handsome, charismatic, and the shrewd heir to the Thorne financial empire, he was a pillar of his community, a generous philanthropist, and a devoted husband. He would often speak of his beautiful Alara with a doting affection that made other women sigh with envy. He bought her extravagant gifts, jewels she never wore, couture gowns that hung in her closet like relics, and paraded her at society events as his most prized possession. But behind the locked doors of Blackwood Manor, this public adoration curdled into a monstrous and suffocating cruelty. Marcus's abuse was not a thing of fists and broken bones. It was a far more insidious poison. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of her entire being. He controlled every aspect of her life with a chilling precision. He managed her finances, leaving her to ask for money like a child. He chose her friends, gradually isolating her from anyone who was truly her own, until his family and his circle were all she had left. He criticized her opinions in public with a patronizing smile, disguising his intellectual bullying as a playful marital spat. "Oh, Alara," he would say, a laugh in his voice that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "That's a sweet thought, darling, but let's leave the complex topics to the adults." He would gaslight her until she questioned her own sanity, turning her legitimate grievances back on her until she was the one apologizing for being too sensitive or too emotional. His greatest weapon was her love for him, the memory of the charming, passionate man she had fallen for a decade ago. He would dangle that memory in front of her, moments of tenderness and affection interspersed between the cruelty, leaving her perpetually off balance, always starving for the kindness, always blaming herself when it was withdrawn. The silent, complicit audience to this slow execution was the Thorne family. They were as much a part of the manor's architecture as the stone gargoyles that stared down from the eaves. The matriarch, Eleanor Thorne, a woman whose spine was forged from iron and whose heart seemed to be a hollow, echoing chamber, had never approved of Alara. She saw her as a commoner, a pretty but penniless nobody who had trapped her brilliant son. Eleanor's criticisms were never direct, but delivered as sharp, passive-aggressive barbs disguised as helpful advice on how to be a proper Thorne wife. The silver must be polished clockwise, dear. It's a small detail, but tradition is the bedrock of this family, she would say, her eyes sweeping over Alara with open disdain. Then there was Marcus's younger brother, Julian, a weak, dissolute man who lived in his brother's shadow, subsisting on the family fortune. He treated Alara with a leering familiarity, his eyes lingering on her a moment too long, his compliments always carrying a sleazy, inappropriate undertone. He saw her not as a person, but as another one of Marcus's beautiful, expensive possessions. And finally, there was Genevieve, Marcus's sister, a bitter, twice-divorced woman whose own life was a string of disappointments. She projected her own unhappiness onto Alara, her jealousy of Alara's beauty and position manifesting as a relentless, biting sarcasm. She would mock Alara's taste, her quiet nature, her background, always with a brittle smile that made it seem like a joke. Together, they formed an impenetrable wall of Thorne arrogance. They saw Marcus's treatment of Alara not as abuse, but as his right. He was the king of their world, and Alara was merely a consort whose only job was to be beautiful, silent, and grateful. When they witnessed his casual cruelty, they saw a strong man keeping his emotional wife in line. They never intervened. They never offered a word of comfort. Her suffering was invisible to them because, in their world, she was not important enough to suffer. They were all feasting on her spirit, a slow, cannibalistic consumption of her soul that had been going on for 10 years. Alara's only solace, her only domain of control, was the kitchen. She had always loved to cook. It was a passion she had inherited from her grandmother, a woman who believed that feeding people was the highest form of love. In the vast, copperpot-filled kitchen of Blackwood Manor, far from the critical eyes of the family, Alara could create. She could impose order, follow precise recipes, and produce something beautiful and nourishing. She became a masterful cook, her skills honed by years of practice and a library of culinary books. Her feasts were legendary, the one thing about her that the Thorne family genuinely admired, though they praised her as one might praise a talented servant. Alara does have a certain domestic genius, Eleanor would concede after a particularly exquisite meal. It was the only validation she ever received, and it was tied to her servitude. The breaking point, the moment a hairline crack appeared in the porcelain cage of her despair, was not a grand, dramatic event. It was a small, quiet act of ultimate cruelty. Alara had a secret. In a forgotten corner of the vast estate, hidden by a crumbling stone wall, she had cultivated a small, wild garden. It was the one place that was truly hers, a patch of earth where she grew heirloom vegetables and fragrant herbs, a place where her hands, not Marcus's money, created life. It was her sanctuary. Marcus found it. He had followed her one day, his suspicion aroused by her solitary walks. He said nothing at first. Then, a week later, he unveiled his surprise. He had hired a team of landscape architects to improve the estate. The centerpiece of their new design was a grand, Italianate fountain. It was built directly on top of her garden. Every plant, every herb, every root she had nurtured was gone, buried under tons of marble and concrete. "Isn't it magnificent, darling?" he said. His arm wrapped around her shoulders as they stood before the garish monument to his control. "I knew you'd love it. Now you have a beautiful, clean space to enjoy." Alara said nothing. She simply stared at the fountain, at the water that now gurgled where her basil and tomatoes had once grown, and something inside her, something that had been slowly dying for a decade, finally turned to ice. It was a cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear shard of pure, unadulterated hatred. He hadn't just destroyed her garden. He had erased the last piece of her identity, the last place where her soul could breathe. That night she did not cry. She lay in their opulent, cold bed, listening to Marcus's steady, self-satisfied breathing, and she began to think. She thought about the Thorne family, this clan of emotional vampires who had watched her fade away, who had smiled and gossiped while her husband dissected her spirit. She thought about how they had all grown fat on her misery, how their power and wealth were built on the silent suffering of others. The thought that came to her was not born of madness, but of a chilling, absolute clarity. It was a piece of perfect, poetic justice, a recipe that began to form in the dark kitchen of her mind. They had feasted on her soul for a decade. The time was coming for them to feast on something else. She would prepare one last, magnificent meal for the Thorne family, a meal they would never forget, a meal that would serve as the final, definitive judgment on the man they had all created and enabled, a meal where the main course would be the flesh and blood of their own king. The ice that had formed in Alara's soul did not melt. Instead, it grew, hardening her, giving her a focus and a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The perpetual fog of depression and self-doubt that Marcus had so carefully cultivated around her began to dissipate, burned away by the cold, clean flame of her newfound purpose. Her grief for her garden, for the last vestiges of her old self, transformed into a quiet, meticulous rage. She was no longer a victim pacing her cage. She was a predator, patiently studying the weaknesses of her captors. She began to watch the Thornes with a new, detached curiosity. She observed them not as family, but as subjects. She noted Eleanor's obsession with legacy and appearances, Julian's pathetic greed and his alcoholism, Genevieve's gnawing, bitter envy. And she watched Marcus. She studied his routines, his habits, his vanities, and his vulnerabilities with the dispassionate eye of a scientist. His arrogance, she realized, was his greatest weakness. He was so utterly convinced of his own superiority, of his absolute control over her, that he would never see the predator hiding behind the eyes of his meek little lamb. Her plan was not a wild, passionate fantasy. It was a complex, multi-layered recipe that she began to assemble in her mind, ingredient by ingredient. The first and most crucial ingredient was Marcus's death. It had to be a death that was both achievable and, most importantly, completely and utterly untraceable to her. It had to look like an accident, a tragic consequence of his own reckless lifestyle. Marcus was a man of extravagant, often dangerous, hobbies. He was a heavy drinker, a reckless driver, and an avid hunter who treated safety protocols with a dismissive contempt. The woods of the Blackwood estate were his private kingdom, and he would often go out hunting alone, fueled by expensive whiskey, his high-powered rifle a phallic extension of his own ego. It was here, in the dark heart of the woods he loved, that Alara saw her opportunity. The plan began to take shape around the Thorne family's most cherished tradition, the annual harvest hunt. It was a weekend-long affair held every autumn, a ritual of masculine bravado and old-world pageantry. Marcus and Julian, along with a host of their wealthy, powerful friends, would spend the day hunting deer on the estate, while Alara, Genevieve, and Eleanor were expected to prepare a lavish feast to celebrate their success. It was the pinnacle of the Thorne social calendar, a perfect tableau of their self-proclaimed nobility. It would be the perfect stage for Alara's final performance. She began her preparations with a chilling, methodical patience. Her first step was to subtly encourage Marcus's recklessness. She started leaving his favorite, most expensive single malt whiskey on the hall table in the evenings. "I thought you might like a nightcap, darling," she would say, her voice full of feigned sweetness. She never once commented on how much he drank, creating a silent, permissive atmosphere for his indulgence. Next, she turned her attention to his hunting equipment. Months before the harvest hunt, she began complaining of a mouse problem in the gun room, a secure, climate-controlled chamber where Marcus stored his arsenal. She insisted on placing modern electronic pest repellents in the room, small devices that emitted a high-frequency sound. Marcus, who knew little of electronics, grudgingly agreed. What he didn't know was that Alara, after weeks of careful research online using a hidden tablet, had purchased a specific, powerful model. The device also emitted a subtle, almost undetectable electromagnetic pulse, designed to interfere with sensitive electronic equipment. Specifically, equipment like the advanced digital scope on Marcus's favorite rifle and the GPS unit he always carried. Her research did not stop there. Under the guise of planning the harvest feast menu, she spent hours in her library, poring over old books. But she wasn't looking at cookbooks. She was studying anatomy charts in old medical encyclopedias and reading detailed 19th century guides on animal butchery that she found in the estate's dusty, forgotten archives. She learned about muscle groups, about the best cuts of meat, about the art of dressing a carcass. She studied the subtle differences between venison and other types of red meat. She was no longer just a cook. She was becoming a student of the flesh. Her final preparation was the most psychologically complex. She had to ensure that after his accident, no one would demand a formal, intrusive autopsy. For this, she needed to manipulate the one person who could make that decision. Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was the Thorne family doctor, a man who had treated them for 40 years. He was old, tired, and deeply in the family's pocket. His practice kept afloat by their generous patronage. He adored Marcus and, like the rest of the family, treated Alara with a dismissive, paternalistic condescension. Weeks before the hunt, Alara scheduled an appointment with Dr. Finch, complaining of anxiety and stress. She sat in his office, the perfect picture of a distraught, fragile wife. She spoke of Marcus's drinking, his increasingly reckless behavior, his refusal to listen to her concerns. She cried, her tears genuine, but her purpose cold as steel. "I'm so worried, doctor," she sobbed, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "He goes into the woods alone after he's been drinking. He won't listen to reason. He thinks he's invincible. What if something were to happen? What if he were to fall?" She was planting a seed, carefully crafting a narrative of a concerned wife and a husband hellbent on self-destruction. Dr. Finch patted her hand, offered her a prescription for tranquilizers, and assured her that "Marcus has always had a wild streak, my dear. Boys will be boys." He had dismissed her, just as she knew he would. But the seed was planted. When the time came, her preemptive concerns would become a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy in his mind. The day of the harvest hunt arrived on a crisp, overcast Saturday in late October. The manor was filled with the loud, booming voices of Marcus's friends. Alara played her part to perfection, the gracious, smiling hostess, her movements calm and serene. No one could have guessed at the maelstrom of calculation that was swirling behind her placid gray eyes. She watched as Marcus prepared for the hunt, his face already flushed from the morning's whiskey. She saw him check his rifle, saw him frown at the digital scope as it flickered erratically. "Damn things on the fritz," he muttered, but his arrogance wouldn't allow him to switch to a different rifle. He was Marcus Thorne. The equipment would bend to his will. She saw him try to turn on his GPS, saw his frustration as it failed to acquire a signal. "Useless modern junk," he grumbled, shoving it into his pocket. The trap was set. As he was about to leave, Alara approached him. She straightened his collar and gave him a soft kiss on the cheek. "Be careful, my love," she whispered, her voice a perfect blend of affection and concern. He just grunted, his mind already on the hunt, and walked out the door without a backward glance. It was the last time she would ever see him alive. She spent the rest of the day in the kitchen, a whirlwind of purposeful activity. She directed the staff, prepared the side dishes, and filled the house with the comforting aromas of baking bread and simmering spices. To any observer, she was the devoted wife preparing a celebratory feast. But with every chop of her knife, with every stir of her spoon, she was preparing for a very different kind of ritual. The hours ticked by, each one a step closer to the moment of her liberation. The hunters were due back at dusk. She knew Marcus would not be with them. He was out there in the woods, alone, half-drunk, with a faulty scope and no GPS, walking toward the destiny she had so carefully prepared for him. Dusk bled across the sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. The hunting party returned to Blackwood Manor in a clamor of boisterous laughter and camaraderie, their trucks laden with the carcasses of several deer. They stomped into the great hall, their faces ruddy from the cold and the whiskey, demanding drinks and warmth. But as the men were counted, a silence fell over the room. Marcus was not among them. Alara, emerging from the kitchen, her apron immaculate, feigned a gentle wifely concern. "Has anyone seen Marcus? He's not back yet." Julian, already slurring his words, waved a dismissive hand. "Probably chasing some legendary buck, you know how he is. Wants to bag the biggest prize himself. He'll stumble in when he's good and ready." But as the hours stretched on, concern curdled into genuine alarm. By nightfall, it was clear something was wrong. A search party was hastily organized. Alara, playing the role of the frantic, terrified wife, was consoled by Eleanor and Genevieve, their expressions more annoyed at the disruption than truly worried. They could not conceive of a world where Marcus Thorne was not in complete control. The search lasted all night. Alara sat in the drawing room, a porcelain cup of untouched tea in her trembling hands, her face a perfect mask of anguish. Inside, she was a statue of ice, her mind a cold, clear chamber of anticipation. Every sound from the woods, every shouted command of the search party, was a note in the symphony of her liberation. Just before dawn, they found him. He was at the bottom of a steep, rocky ravine in a remote part of the estate, a place known for its treacherous footing. His high-powered rifle lay beside him, its stock shattered. His neck was broken. He was quite dead. The narrative she had so carefully constructed fell perfectly into place. The faulty GPS had led him astray. The malfunctioning scope had likely frustrated him, making him careless. The whiskey had done the rest. He had stumbled in the fading light, lost his footing, and fallen to his death. It was a tragic, foolish, and entirely believable accident. Dr. Finch arrived, his face grim. He examined the body, clucking his tongue at the empty whiskey flask they found in Marcus's coat pocket. He looked at Alara, her face pale and tear-streaked, and remembered her desperate visit to his office. "You were right to be worried, my dear," he said, his voice heavy with paternalistic sympathy. The man was a law unto himself. He signed the death certificate on the spot. Cause of death: accidental fall. He saw no reason to subject the grieving family to the trauma of a formal autopsy. The Thorne name would be spared the indignity. The days that followed were a blur of somber formalities. Condolences were offered, funeral arrangements were made. Alara moved through it all like a ghost, her grief so convincing that even the cynical Eleanor was forced to concede that the girl must have truly loved him, in her own simple way. The family was too consumed with the impending transfer of power and the reading of the will to pay much attention to the grieving widow. They saw her as a temporary, tragic figurehead who would soon be quietly pensioned off. But Alara had no intention of being pensioned off. Her work had only just begun. The night after Marcus's body was brought back to the manor to be prepared by the undertaker, she enacted the most crucial phase of her plan. She dismissed the staff, telling them she needed to be alone with her grief. Once the house was silent, wrapped in the profound, heavy quiet of death, she descended into the labyrinthine cellars beneath the manor. At the far end of the wine cellar, behind a false wall that had once hidden Prohibition-era liquor, was a small, stone-walled room. It was the old game larder, a cold, dry space with heavy steel hooks hanging from the ceiling, where generations of Thorns had aged the deer from their hunts. It was windowless, soundproof, and utterly isolated from the rest of the house. For the next few hours, it would become Alara's abattoir. Getting Marcus's body there was the first challenge. The undertaker had laid him out in a closed casket in the formal drawing room to await the funeral. Using a service trolley hidden under a velvet cloth, moving with a strength born of pure, cold adrenaline, Alara transported her husband's body from the casket to the cellar. Her heart did not pound. Her hands did not shake. The woman who had been afraid to voice an opinion in her own home was now committing an act of such monstrous transgression that it defied imagination, and she felt nothing but a profound, chilling calm. Inside the game larder, she worked by the stark, sterile light of a single bare bulb. What followed was not an act of rage or desecration. It was an act of meticulous, culinary preparation. She was not defiling a corpse. She was butchering a carcass. The skills she had learned from the old books, the precision of her years in the kitchen, were all brought to bear. She worked with the detachment of a surgeon, her movements economical and precise. She saw the body not as the man who had tormented her, but as an ingredient. Muscle, sinew, and bone. She treated the flesh with a bizarre reverence, wasting nothing. The best cuts, the tenderloins, the haunches, the saddle were carefully prepared, vacuum-sealed, and placed in a large, commercial-grade freezer she had secretly had installed in the larder months ago under the guise of storing provisions for the winter. The rest was methodically processed, the meat ground, the bones set aside for stock. The process took hours, a gruesome, silent testament to the depth of her transformation. When she was finished, the room was scrubbed clean, sterilized until not a single trace of her work remained. Marcus Thorne, the man, had ceased to exist. In his place was a carefully catalogued selection of prime cuts, ready for the feast. The empty space in the casket was filled with sandbags from the garden shed, weighted to match Marcus's body precisely. The funeral was held 2 days later. The casket remained closed, a decision Alara insisted upon, to preserve the memory of how he was in life. No one questioned it. They watched as the heavy wooden box was lowered into the cold, dark earth of the Thorne family plot. They mourned the man they thought was inside, while the true remains lay frozen in a secret chamber, awaiting their final, terrible purpose. With Marcus buried, the family's attention turned to the will. As expected, the vast majority of the Thorne fortune was left in a trust, to be managed by Eleanor until Julian's children came of age. Alara was left a generous, but finite settlement enough to live comfortably, but not enough to maintain her position. She was to be gracefully ejected from Blackwood Manor. It was then that she made her final move. She gathered the family in the drawing room. Her voice, though still soft, had a new, unbreakable core of authority. She announced that, as her final act as the lady of the manor, she would host a grand memorial feast in Marcus's honor. It would be a celebration of his life, a final goodbye. "It's what he would have wanted," she said, her gray eyes meeting each of their gazes. A last gathering of the family he loved so dearly. The Thornes, motivated by greed and a sense of tradition, readily agreed. A feast in Marcus's honor seemed appropriate. And besides, it would be their last opportunity to enjoy Alara's magnificent cooking. They set a date for the following Saturday. They had no idea they were RSVPing to the most monstrous dinner party ever conceived. They were coming to honor the memory of Marcus Thorne, blissfully unaware that they would be doing so by consuming him, piece by piece. The night of the memorial feast descended upon Blackwood Manor with a cold, theatrical stillness. A sliver of a moon hung in the inky sky, and the ancient oaks surrounding the house cast long, grasping shadows. Inside, however, the manor was ablaze with a warm, inviting light. The great dining hall, a cavernous room with a vaulted ceiling and a fireplace large enough to stand in, had been prepared for its final performance. The long mahogany table was set with the finest Thorne china and silver, polished to a gleam. Dozens of tapered candles cast a soft, flickering glow, making the crystal glasses sparkle like captured stars. The air was filled with the rich, complex aromas of roasting meat, simmering sauces, and fragrant herbs. It was a scene of perfect, civilized elegance. Alara stood for a moment in the doorway, observing her masterpiece. She was dressed in a simple, elegant black gown, her hair coiled at the nape of her neck. She was the picture of a grieving but composed widow. But her eyes, in the candlelight, held a strange, luminous intensity. She was not a mourner. She was a high priestess, preparing to officiate a sacred, terrible rite. The guests arrived. Eleanor Thorne, draped in black silk and family pearls, looking every bit the imperious queen of a fallen kingdom. Julian, his face puffy and his movements unsteady, already half drunk and looking forward to being fully so. Genevieve, her face a mask of sour piety, her eyes darting around the room, already assessing what she might take as a memento when Alara was finally gone. They were not here to grieve. They were here to claim their inheritance, to perform the final act of the Thorn dynasty's transition of power. Elara greeted them with a serene, almost beatific calm that they mistook for shock. She moved among them, a ghostly, graceful presence, ensuring their glasses were filled, murmuring appropriate responses to their hollow condolences. "You are being so brave, dear," Eleanor said, patting Elara's arm with a cold, dry hand. "Marcus would be proud." "I'm just doing what he would have wanted," Elara replied, her voice smooth as silk. "He always loved a good family feast." They took their seats at the table, their places marked by elegant calligraphed cards. Elara sat at the head of the table, the seat that had always been Marcus's, and for the first time, she felt its power. From this vantage point, she could see them all, her unwitting congregation. The meal began. The first course was a rich, dark consommé, a bone broth she had been simmering for 3 days. It was intensely flavorful, with a depth that was almost primal. "My word, Elara," Julian slurred, spooning it down greedily. "This is magnificent. What's your secret?" "Patience," Elara said with a small smile, "and using the very best bones." The main course was the piece de resistance. It was brought out on a massive silver platter, a magnificent roast, glistening under a glaze of herbs and red wine, surrounded by roasted root vegetables. It was a work of art, perfectly cooked, the meat so tender it seemed to sigh under the carving knife. Elara carved it herself, her movements sure and practiced, serving each of the Thorns a generous portion. They ate with the voracious, unthinking appetites of the privileged. They praised the meal, their conversation a ghastly counterpoint to the act they were performing. "This meat is extraordinary, Elara," Genevieve commented, her mouth full. "So tender. It's not venison, is it? It's richer." "It's a specialty," Elara replied, her eyes twinkling in the candlelight. "A very rare breed, locally sourced." Eleanor, the matriarch, ate with a refined, critical air, but even she was impressed. "Marcus always appreciated a well-prepared roast," she said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "He had a robust and traditional palate. This would have pleased him greatly." "I'm so glad," Elara said, her voice a soft purr. "I made it especially for him, in his honor." As they ate the main course, Elara regaled them with stories of Marcus. But the stories she told were not the sanitized, heroic tales they were used to. She told them soft, subtle stories, anecdotes that, on the surface, sounded loving, but were laced with the poison of truth. She spoke of his strong will, a euphemism for his bullying. She recalled his passionate nature, a veiled reference to his violent temper. She spoke of his uncompromising standards, a nod to his impossible, soul-crushing demands. She was delivering his eulogy, but only she understood the true meaning of the words. The Thorns, deaf to any criticism of their golden boy, just nodded along, too busy devouring the evidence of his sins to understand them. The meal was accompanied by the finest wines from the Thorns' cellar, wines that Marcus had been saving for special occasions. Elara encouraged them to drink, her own glass remaining untouched. As the evening wore on, the wine and the rich food loosened their tongues. Their talk turned to the future, to the Thorn Empire, to the money. They began to bicker and posture, their grief a forgotten pretense, their true, greedy natures on full display. They were vultures, picking over a carcass, utterly oblivious to the grotesque, literal truth of that metaphor. Elara just watched, a silent, smiling observer. She had created this moment, this perfect, horrifying tableau. She had set the stage, prepared the meal, and directed the players. The Thorns, who had spent a decade treating her as less than human, were now performing their final act for her, and for her alone. They were consuming their own legacy, swallowing their own king, and in doing so, they were becoming irrevocably, eternally tainted by his corruption. The main course was finished, the platter empty. The bones, picked clean, were all that remained. The family was sated, drunk, and content. The candles had burned low, the shadows in the room growing longer and deeper. The feast was almost over. All that was left was for the chef to reveal the secret ingredient. After the plates from the main course were cleared, a heavy, wine-fueled silence settled over the dining table. The Thorns were flush-faced and lethargic, their greed sated. They were ready for dessert, for coffee, for the evening to conclude so they could return to the business of dividing the spoils of Marcus's life. But Alara had one final course to serve. She did not rise. She simply cleared her throat, a soft, delicate sound that nonetheless cut through the thick silence like a shard of glass. All eyes turned to her. "I'm so glad you could all be here tonight," she began, her voice calm and steady, devoid of the timid hesitation they were so used to. "It means so much to me that we could honor Marcus's memory together, as a family." Eleanor nodded regally. "It was the proper thing to do, Alara. You have been a dutiful wife to the very end." A strange, small smile played on Alara's lips. "Dutiful?" she repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose I have been. I have spent the last 10 years of my life trying to be the wife that Marcus, and all of you, demanded. I learned to keep a beautiful house. I learned to be a gracious hostess. And, as you have all been so kind to point out this evening, I learned to be an exceptional cook." She paused, her gaze sweeping over their faces, one by one. She looked at Eleanor's rigid pride, Julian's drunken stupor, Genevieve's bitter impatience. "I learned that to please a Thorn, the food must be of the absolute finest quality," she continued, her voice taking on a new, harder edge. "The ingredients must be sourced with care. The preparation must be flawless. And the final dish must be meaningful." Julian, growing impatient, poured himself another large glass of wine. "Well, you certainly succeeded tonight, Alara. Best meal I've had in years. Now, what's for dessert?" Alara's smile widened, but it did not reach her eyes. "For dessert," she said slowly, "I am serving the truth. It's a dish I find is best served hot, after a particularly satisfying meal." A flicker of unease finally entered the room. There was something in Alara's tone, in her unnerving calm, that was deeply unsettling. "I'm so glad you enjoyed the roast," she went on, her voice dropping to an almost conversational whisper. "I was particularly proud of it. As Genevieve noted, it wasn't venison. It was something much more familiar. I believe the term is long pig." The term hung in the air, meaningless to them. They stared at her blankly. "You see," Alara explained, as if lecturing a group of slow-witted children, "I wanted this meal to be a true tribute to Marcus, a way for the family he built, the family who enabled him, the family who fed on his power while he fed on my soul, to become truly one with him, to take him into yourselves, to digest his legacy." The color began to drain from Genevieve's face as a dawning, monstrous comprehension flickered in her eyes. "What are you talking about, Alara? What did you serve us?" Alara leaned forward, her gray eyes glinting like polished steel in the candlelight. She spoke the final words with a slow, deliberate, and chilling clarity. "I served you, Marcus." For a moment, there was absolute, stunned silence. The statement was so insane, so impossible, that their minds refused to process it. Then chaos erupted. Julian let out a strangled gasp, his face turning a ghastly shade of green before he violently retched onto the priceless Persian rug. Genevieve screamed, a raw, piercing shriek of pure horror as she clawed at her own throat. Eleanor Thorne, for the first time in her life, was utterly speechless, her face a frozen mask of disbelief and revulsion, her body rigid with shock. "You are a monster," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that was overshadowed by sheer terror. "Am I?" Alara countered, her voice still unervingly calm. "Or am I just a reflection of the monster you all created and condoned? You devoured my life, my spirit, my happiness, for 10 years and called it family tradition. I simply made the metaphor literal for one evening. You consumed my soul, so I fed you his body. It seems perfectly symmetrical to me." She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and graceful. She looked down at the wreckage of the Thorne family, at the vomit and the tears and the sheer, unadulterated horror that had replaced their arrogant composure. She had not just killed Marcus. She had annihilated his legacy. She had turned them into cannibals. She had forced them to participate in the ultimate act of desecration. This was her victory. The knowledge of what they had done would be a poison in their veins for the rest of their lives. They could never go to the police, for what would they say? Our sister-in-law murdered our brother and served him to us for dinner, and we ate him and asked for seconds. They were trapped, bound together forever by this grotesque, unspeakable secret. Their name, their legacy, was now irrevocably tainted by an act of primitive horror. Alara walked out of the dining hall without a backward glance. She did not run. She did not pack a bag. She simply walked through the great hall, opened the massive front doors of Blackwood Manor, and stepped out into the cold, clean night air. She left her jewels, her clothes, her marriage, and her past behind her in that house of horrors. As she walked down the long, dark driveway, the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating her path. She did not know where she was going, and she did not care. For the first time in a decade, she was not a prisoner. She was free. The porcelain cage was shattered, and the dynasty of the Thorns was nothing more than a tomb filled with the ghosts of their own making, forever haunted by the memory of their last, terrible supper.